atrocity like Charlie Hebdo, and then we kind of all know the story, but how many of us were reading the magazine, read the original magazine, saw the cartoons, knew what the detail was behind it? And that, I think that's what I'm talking about, this kind of condensing of politics down to a narrowing of debate, and that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, and there's an example that is not very widely written about, but during the Second World War there was an organisation called the Army Bureau of Current Affairs, and the whole idea was that it was providing education for the troops about all kinds of social and political issues, but giving them some idea of why they were fighting, what was Russia's stand on this, what had happened in Germany, but also what was happening in Britain. How did you want a welfare state to look like? And it actually encouraged people. It's like, you're risking your life, but what do you want Britain to be after that? It was done through pamphlets and posters, and each kind of officer had to sit down with his immediate troops, and they would discuss this material that had been put before them. And I kind of think that's, nowadays that feels like a kind of mind-blowingly progressive education of people who are going to vote and be citizens.
Yeah.
I mean, I completely agree in a sense. I think the need for criticality. I mean, I think the visual is actually really, it's really powerful today, but not necessarily in terms of a positive sense. No. I mean, we're saturated by the visual, but the kind of danger is, I think, of the kind of decontextualized image. So, these images float around the ether, and they get picked up on, and they get taken to mean whatever people want them to mean for their kind of ends. And images can be manipulated easily. We have all sorts of horrible stories of, even from Grenfell, people putting up fake images of people that they were saying were missing in the tower, which, with a bit of, I wouldn't say cynicism, even just kind of questioning, with a bit of skills into to thinking a bit more about where these images come from, and therefore what kinds of intentions kind of lie behind its creation and dissemination. And those are the kind of things.
I probably shouldn't have said cynicism, my own criticality. I think it is really our own criticality towards these things.
But it does engender cynicism. I think that's the danger.
I think we're talking about shifting social consensus, and design does that, and very powerfully, and that can be very good, and it, depending on your stance, it can be very negative. And I think informing people about the range of questions is, to me, the importance, rather than narrowing it down to sound bites, or to, as you say, unattached images that then get repeated and repeated, become memes. That people think, well, this is a badge, I'm just going to spread this around. I don't really think about what the meaning is behind it, or the intention behind it.
So going on to think about, because we've been kind of talking a lot about sort of design as a profession, but sort of another sort of visual trope recently has been to make your own, that kind of craftivism, DIY, whether it's painted placards or kind of pink pussy hats. What role do you think that has to play? That sort of, is that an empowering thing for people to be making their own political message designed and put into the world, or does it become a distraction from actually doing something? Because I think you nominated the pussy hat for the design
one of my nominations for the Design of the Year. I think the interesting thing about the kind of craftivism, as it's called sometimes, is that it's not just about wearing a knitted, like a crafted item. It's about, as you say, the making. It's like the process of being involved in these kind of communities. That communities could be physically located or spread all over the world, which is, I think, one of the interesting things about something like the pussy hat. You've got 2 women based in the States, and this becomes a global phenomenon. I think these things are hugely effective, and yet we live in a world where people can, effective in the sense that they make politics visible and say that there is a large amount of the population that doesn't agree with what's going on. But what we seem to be having at the moment, if you certainly look to the States, is a kind of, that doesn't translate into actually political change, and the same would go here. So I think, and the same would be true of something like the Banner Lending Library, which is in Chicago, where you can both make your own political banners, but you can also rent out kind of handcrafted banners. So there's all these amazing ways that kind of people feel the need for grassroots actions,
Yeah.
which makes a lot of sense. And I hope that this then means that change manifests from that, but yeah, I'm not quite sure where the world is going in that sense right now.
Are we not talking about sort of, with this, this is presumably potential career opportunities here and potential, is this where we're sort of...
Could be.
Could be. Right, okay. How many people would seriously consider embarking on doing that sort of thing, bearing in mind, the sort of the financial sort of state of the country at this present moment in time? Would you take the risk,
I think
in a commercial sense?
we're also talking about people who aren't even thinking of themselves as designers, but just
Right.
you want to put your message into the world,
Yes.
and so you're just going to do it through very simple means, and so like sort of painting your placard the night before.
Right, I see.
I tend to think of a lot of it as a distraction. My answer would be to your question. But having said that, I mean, I come from a background. A lot of my work, I'm a graphic designer and a graphic design historian. I got called by Rick Point. I was a bit disturbed by that. And most of my work, and my PhD and most of my postdoctoral work is about punk and punk graphics and the DIY ethos in punk. I'm really fascinated by as actually a genuine sense of empowerment and inclusion for people. So there was a genuine, and there's the DIY aspect of it, which was a means to an end to get something done. But there's a DIY aspect which was communal, which was about, no, we can do it. We're going to show you how to do it. And I think that was really empowering for a generation of people. Still is actually. It's a big punk DIY scene worldwide now. And I can see that side of it with the activism. I can see that it's kind of establishing communities and it's helping people get to know other people and have a dialogue and those kind of things. I think that's one of the great things about it. And what worries me about the placards and the banners and things is that, like you say, I'm not seeing any effective change coming from that, or people feeling good about themselves that they've been on a march, but I'm not really seeing where that takes us.
Maybe that's enough in the sense of it's about the scale of where you're political and where you feel effective in being political. So you can do that within your local community, and again a community that could be internationally distributed. But in terms of where power is located, that's a different kind of activism, I think.
Yeah, and I think those kind of moments can be starting points, and it's whether they are taken as starting points or an end in themselves. And I don't think any sort of form of craft or design is going to work unless it has a strong movement that then builds behind it, that has kind of aims and momentum. So I was thinking of the ACT UP campaign in America in the 1980s to galvanise the gay community to demand government action. Really powerful graphic symbol that was kind of homegrown and then used multiple different mediums and platforms and that, but that had a really strong organised movement behind it, and so then I think it really worked.
Just as an aside, you talk about punk. That sort of visual genre, if you like, of punk and then more recently urban culture, has actually become a standard visual language, if you like, or influenced a standard visual language for a lot of illustration and graphics. I think the only sad thing with that is that a lot of it hasn't been used, for political reasons or for any sense of pushing any sort of opinion or anything else. Most of it has just been used in a rather ambient sort of way for fashion, advertising, youth brand. I think it's T-shirts and.
But there's another story to it, because I'm not going to give a lecture about punk graphics, but where there's a constant battle between things becoming accepted and a constant move away from, as things become, one style becomes accepted, people move and become even more antagonistic, even louder, even more ugly, even more brutal. So we're going to make things that make a visual language that is never going to be appropriated to be a commercial visual language, because and it gets darker and it gets harder. And it gets more ugly, because that won't become a Nike campaign or something, because it's really nasty. And there's that's what I find quite interesting about it. It doesn't really solve anything. It doesn't resolve anything politically, I don't think. But I'm quite fascinated by that constant striving to avoid recuperation.
Yeah.
And that's something that harks back to 20th century art movements, Dada onwards, and the Situationists particularly, I think, and even though punks wouldn't say so. But it's, there's that tradition of how do we have a counterculture or counter language and a counter visual language that is going to stay away from the mainstream. That's one of the interesting histories. And the DIY thing very much fits in with that.
Yeah.
So it doesn't become like, so your marches with the pussy hats or with the homemade placards, at least they're not carrying Socialist Workers' Party branded banners. At least they're not that typography, that red and black soft signage that we see at every protest, the rent-a-mob, that's being printed at the SWP print shop. At least people are doing something for themselves, and you're seeing a kind of a uniqueness to their visual language.
I think also just that sort of remembering that you can make something just sort of subtly changes your position in the world, but you're not just a passive consumer anymore. You can remember that you do actually have the power to make something, and then can that filter on to feeling you have the power to actually change things. So I kind of think it can be a starting point. Shall we open it up to questions now? Would anyone like to ask questions to any of us?
Hello, sorry. I wanted to come back to that point that you said about sort of designers potentially being part of a service, or as an author, as a maker in your own right. And I wanted to kind of get your take on whether you feel, as design educators, that design schools have more responsibility to kind of enable and, I don't know, kind of empower their students to be authors. Because I do a little bit of like design tutoring, and what I really see happening often is that students firmly see themselves as a service, and so the ethical choice that they're making is the choice of others. Often the projects that they're working on, they are being authors, they're constructing their own businesses, their own approaches, their own ways of doing things. But then suddenly when they make that shift over to professional life, they see themselves purely as, well, what's the agency that I'm going to work for, as opposed to, actually I have a really strong idea and I understand the design process well enough to carry this through as something that I can make. So,
I think actually that things are starting to change a little bit now. I used to rather disingenuously call sort of those sorts of illustrators and designers that worked at the sort of level you're talking about, colouring in technicians. Because fundamentally they were working very much to a prescribed brief. That's what you're sort of saying, isn't it? You know, within an agency or a design group or wherever it might be. I mean, for a few years now, I've been advocating this. I suppose it's a philosophical thing, but it is, a lot of it is born out of practice and knowing how the creative industries and everything work. And I've actually called it the polymath principle, right? Which I think that you can apply that to any discipline, really, provided that all the transferable skills that you acquire as part of your education cease to become transferable skills, but are uplifted to specific skills that are all equal, so they're all high level. So you might train as an illustrator, but you're also these other things as well. And I'm not just talking about sort of creative practice, I'm talking about sort of having intellectual skills and knowledge-based skills. Because if we go back to the great polymaths of the Renaissance and all those periods, you know, I mean, they were scientists, they were engineers, they were all sorts of things. And they were so clever that they could externalize all their ideas by drawing it and illustrating it, because for me, they were all illustrators. And you can argue with me if you don't agree with that, but that's what I'm saying. So, but the thing is, getting back to today, what you'll find is that in a lot of design groups now, rather than employ or talk about people who are on the staff as being narrowly focused or subject specific, they're just broadly calling them creatives. Someone that can think outside the box and have ideas and manage and have the technical skills, but have the intellectual skills to be able to solve all those problems and know and understand a whole lot and take ownership of certain projects. I mean, I've got a couple of ex-students of mine now. I'll give you an example. One is working at Dorling Kindersley, which is the children's book publisher. And they specialise in sort of information books for kids, and they do a lot of these interactive books with all these weird and wonderful pop-ups that come up and all this sort of stuff. Well, now 2 or 3 of my students, they're employed there to actually conceive ideas for the books. They write them, research them, design them, make them, and they even have ideas about marketing them. So it is actually happening. And I think that the onus of responsibility for a lot of this has to start off at education. You know, and it's choosing, you know, I would say this to any prospective BA student wanting to do art and design. You've got to look at the right course and make sure that they're targeting it all properly. I don't want to get too politicised with higher education, but there is one thing I would say is that none of them really would want to go down this path by having a course which was so generalised, because they're all concerned with finance, and the more students they bring in, the better off they are. So they wouldn't actually go down that path. It's expedient for them to have a huge graphic design course, a huge illustration course, a huge photography course, and so on, and whatever. But anyway, that's how I see it, and where I think things are going to go, and it's something which I've been advocating for quite a long time.
I think it's striking a balance between a range of things, because I know what you're talking about, but I was going to say it's the opposite. In my experience in the sort of where I teach, I worry about the lack of applied thinking in designs in some design schools, and I examine at other design schools. I think the shift in higher education from the old H&D model of vocational training in design into the BA model of kind of creative expression and calling it design has led to, you know, now we get students get asked to design, create a major project and brief and write their own brief, and they tend to choose kind of big ideas and concepts and talk about the concept rather than the form. And I worry that things go too far the other way. So I don't really want to go to a college and see every student designing a wine bottle label, although wine bottle labels need designing. But at the same time, I don't want to go to a college and find students saying I'm designing, I don't know, some vision of clouds because they inspire me. I'm trying to get some balance between those two things, so the conceptual and the practical, I guess.
Yeah, I think design education is in a really tricky place right now. There's been so many kind of cuts and pressures at GCSE level, A level, and then into HE that the numbers able to even contemplate a design degree is kind of reducing. All these financial pressures that are felt by the institution but also felt by the students, that the idea of the art school is a space that's meant to be a kind of autonomous, I think, as well. That if you know, university is still meant to be a place where you can go and kind of take risks and learn things that don't have any use, and you know, kind of be a space for free thinking and challenging everything. And I'm in a particular position of a lot of the teaching I do is I get to sort of poke at what they're doing in the studio. So I teach design history into the design students, and I'm lucky. My job is sort of making them question and think about the kind of industry that they're moving into. But we certainly have a responsibility, to go back to your question, to think about what kind of education we're giving the students, and what kind of careers we could be helping them into, or what kind of careers they could be building. I mean, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's become a lot more the kind of autonomy that you're talking about, that you can be everything in yourself, and therefore arguably you can actually make a company that does what you want it to do.
Yeah.
The pressures of... Sorry, was someone...
Yeah, the back.
Questions?
Oh, right,
Let's do it back.
And thank you for raising the amnesty example, because it's fascinating and it has been for decades and decades. So we want to have visual artists, graphic artists, people working in PR, and those, and these are rigid kind of boxes, often they tend research in public policy, etc., between wanting to moderate messages, visual messages, and editorial messages, so they don't create the wrong thing. So, for example, the best example I can think of is the AIDS tombstone in 1984, and there's this whole phenomena in the 80s and 90s, sexual health anxiety, actually creating subcultures, deviant subcultures in the public's eye, which actually really went against efforts, for example, to try to reduce prevalence rates in HIV. So I'm just curious to know how I think. I agree that, you know, at times we need to push, but I think it's a constant battle between these two sides. Is there anything at the moment, as visual artists and designers, we can do to make things to sort of win that argument but still be sensitive to those issues?
Well, I mean, the trouble is, and I did allude to this, is that there are formal barriers that exist at a high level. You know, it's like I said, we have the Advertising Standards Authority and various other things which go out of their way to keep things moderated, unless, and that's a political thing, isn't it? You know, I mean, they're controlled in that sort of way. My view is, unless you can break that down and change the way in which they work and think, I'm not quite sure how we can progress with it. You know, I mean, the analogy I made was looking at another country and comparing the way they interpreted the campaign and presented it with this one. They obviously have a more liberal attitude to that sort of thing.
Is there a question as well of when you're designing something, you're like that, you're speaking on behalf of other people, which is always tricky.
Yeah, yes.
So going back to the AIDS example, is it about processes of consultation and involving people in informing those kind of statements?
I think, sorry, can I just say one thing? I think what's really interesting in the emerging field of service design is that actually empathy is the right essential design process for something like the grant design to start with that. So it has a huge
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit? We can't.
Sorry. So I think what's interesting if you look at the emerging practice of service design is that empathy is obviously at its core, and I think graphic design it's really starting to embrace empathy at the core of design, but really quite actively. So it'd be interesting to see what happens in coming decades.
I think you're also giving it's a great example that you've given, but I think there's also the benefit of hindsight and unintended consequences that the designers that design something for a campaign, particularly as a big public information campaign, have one set of intentions, or the commissioner of that brief has a certain set of intentions to educate, and there are unfortunate consequences that come from it over time. I was trying to think of a contemporary example. In terms of iconic images, it's things like the Obama Hope poster from years ago, the Shepherd Fairy one. But then that thing becomes a meme, which then gets reiterated and reiterated. So you get Hillary Clinton with hope on it, or whatever it might be, or Trump with hate on it, or whatever. They become visual cliches and lose all sense of the original intention of what they were aiming to be. So I think that's the difficulties. The very powerful messages like that, they resonate, we can remember them, and then there's unintended consequences that we're not in control of.
I think it's a bigger issue than design. That question of censorship right now and kind of freedom of speech, that we're all sort of want to kind of talk about freedom of speech a lot, but actually in terms of what you in terms of offending different kinds of identities. It feels like we're on very tricky terrain, I think. And while it's bigger than design, I think actually design could actually provide, if it finds a way to do so, could find a really a positive way to kind of bridge this this kind of sensitivity and this need to kind of talk about when things aren't right and aren't working. So yeah, which is to say I don't have an answer, but I think it's an important question.
question at the back, I think.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on graphic designers being hands-on. So I've got two questions. First one is, do you think graphic designers as practitioners are holding themselves to professional standards? So say unpaid internships, agencies holding permanent internship placements so that they just cycle through internships because it's ultimately cheaper than hiring someone permanently. These young kids are kind of going in thinking, oh, I might get a promotion, but then actually that's just the way this company's surviving. So do you think that designers and agencies, etc., are holding themselves to their own standards when they may actually also be set up by young idealistic people who are trying to have a positive social impact but not helping their own fellow practitioners? The other thing I was interested to discuss is whether you think technology allows a very small number of people to have a great impact. So say, you hear about like Instagram being started by 12 people, and it has an absolute global impact. So you have much fewer jobs for creatives, having a greater impact, but you still have the same number of people wanting to have that impact. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that issue.
Over to you.
For the first half of the question, I think, was it Stephen Heller that said with graphic design just greasing the wheels of industry with style and taste? That idea that we are just service agents of a capitalist system, and graphic design agencies that are, running interns constantly, etc. Yes, it's appalling, but I don't kind of expect graphic design as an industry to be any different to any other industry, and I expect little of any of them. So I'm not really surprised that is the case, and I think it's unfortunate, and I wish it was different. But then we're in the land of make-believe that says, I want to move outside this system, which is a much bigger thing. So that sounds really defeatist, doesn't it? Sounds like, oh, give up with this because it's miserable out there. But it is.
I think in a general sense, though, you talk about internships in design groups or ad agencies, whatever. I mean, my brother runs a finance company. Yeah, they have internships and apprenticeships and all the rest of it. I think you'll find that most companies do. It's just as Russell was saying, it's just part and parcel of the system that we're in.
And as you say, a shrinking design industry that can be where small groups of people, creatives for Instagram or whatever it might be, can create something that gets really, really huge. In some ways, you think, well, that's fantastic. That's a bit like the design lottery, isn't it? We're all looking for that nub of an idea that's going to be a massive success.
I'm going to slightly counter that because I think if we don't say that there should be another way of doing internships and actually live that and put that in place, then it will continue. But at Kingston, for example, you can apply for internships through the university, and they don't offer any internships that are unpaid. And it's only when people actually start doing that and not taking up unpaid positions, then companies will go, well, no one's actually applying for this.
And ultimately, you're devaluing your profession because you're saying that it's not worth being.
We are better than this.
It's just me.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting because we used to, as you can imagine, like illustrators, for example, a lot of illustrators tend to work in a freelance, self-employed capacity, and you will get possibly a one-off commission like the one I was describing at the very beginning. And a lot of companies, even dare I say, big, well-known, high-status companies from London and around, would approach us with a job, i.e. an illustration to do. And they would say, well, they would ask for a quote. And I used to quote what I would expect if I was doing the job myself. And then they come back and say, well, what? That's far, far too much. Because what they were really expecting was like a pittance to be paid because, oh, these are just students. But as you were saying this, they're not just students. See, these are illustrators that in a not too distant future could well be at the pinnacle of the profession, and so that was one way in which we sort of counteracted that.
For any students here, you know, there's some wise tutors here, I'm sure, in the audience, or people who've experienced design education. Every course leader and every senior tutor gets constant barrage of requests saying, oh, perhaps you could set this as a design competition for your students, and I'll give them a prize, I'll give them a £5.
That's it,
And it's just constant, and there's just the constant refusal or ignoring those messages. So yeah, I agree. Actually, I'm trying not to be defeatist. I ran a business with Ian Noble that I wrote the books for Bloomsbury with, and for many years, and we were the world's least successful design business because we just did everything for nothing. Or if we got paid a fee, we'd think, oh, wouldn't it be really nice if that was foil blocked? Oh, how much is that? Oh, it's the design fee. Oh, well, we'll foil block it anyway. And we would do things that were just incredibly expensive, and we'd end up paying to do things because we liked making things that were good. And I'm kind of still like that. The amount of work I do for nothing is just ridiculous. But I get a sense of satisfaction by doing it. So I don't know. I'm not one to talk. I can't really give you an idea about industry. I can say as a creative person, I get satisfaction from making things. And if I don't get any money from it, I don't really care that much. If I can pay the rent.
You have to make the choice. I think that's the thing. You have to decide, you know, on that. But can I stick to your second question about these companies kind of not taking jobs? So I don't really see that as a picture of where design is today. I think, you know, for all their, however other ways you might want to talk about all these kind of social media companies or whatever, they are part of a massive creation of actually more creative jobs. Because if you look at the World Economic Forum, they published, when it was last year, or this year maybe, the kind of top 10 skills that are required by employers in 2015 and what they're going to require in 2020. And number 2 in 2020, you'll be pleased to hear, is critical thinking. And creativity has gone way up as well in terms of what is going to be valued. So jobs, like types of design and types of creativity are kind of growing all the time. I mean, you know, service design, that was mentioned earlier, that wasn't really even a kind of a sector 10, 15 years ago. So there will be plenty, there is a bright future. I'm going to be like anti.
Come in through miserable.
The thing that I was trying to say is that we have so much capability. So one person can set up a magazine, get contributions, print it, bind it, distribute it by themselves. And that you kind of end up being this polymath, like you're saying, doing everything. But I don't know, does that mean that everything's to the same standards? And also, are you sacrificing somewhere, like you're getting unpaid contributions, or we have so much capability that it has an impact on the outcome in terms of the product, in terms of the process, and in terms of the impact it has on other designers as well. So their capacity to join you, and so take on a typographer, take on a, I mean, that used to be where it kind of isn't now.
So this is what you were talking about, Catherine was talking about at the beginning, that no technology is neutral. So while, you know, the digital has been having an incredible kind of democratizing effect, and that we could all kind of publish our own magazines, there's good and kind of bad qualities of that. And so you have to make decisions, you have to actively decide, not kind of passively accept the way things seem to be, you know, the kind of status quo, which is hopefully what design education can help with.
Actually, sometimes I worry a little bit about the kind of celebration of creativity in the creative industries, not in themselves, but that there's, I think, because as work generally becomes more precarious, and we're all told that we have to be innovators and thinkers, and it's no good just to kind of go and do a job. You've kind of constantly got to be presenting yourself